Close your eyes. Imagine a small patch of land, nothing more than hills by a slow river, where shepherds once tended their flocks. No marble, no armies, no emperors, just dust, hunger, and the whisper of forgotten gods. From this soil would rise a city that devoured nations, a people who carved their name into stone, into blood, into eternity itself. But what rises must also fall, and the story of Rome is not just glory, but betrayal, madness, and fire. Tonight, you will hear it all: the birth, the triumph, and the death of an empire that believed it could never die. Every empire begins with a story, and Rome begins with blood. Long before marble palaces, long before the roar of the Colosseum, there were only hills, forests, and the river Tiber winding like a silver serpent. Here, according to legend, two brothers were born into a world that wanted them dead. Romulus and Remus, names that would echo forever, began their lives not in glory, but in abandonment. They were the children of Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin forced to remain pure, but the gods had other plans. She gave birth to twins, and their very existence was seen as a threat to the throne. The infants were condemned, cast into a basket, and sent drifting down the river, destined to vanish into silence. But fate intervened. The basket ran aground, and there, beneath the shadow of the Palatine Hill, the twins were discovered, not by a king, not by a noble, but by a she-wolf. The beast, a creature feared by men, bent down and suckled the infants as if they were her own cubs. And so the legend says, the founders of Rome were not raised by men, but by the wild children of tooth and claw, nurtured by the wilderness itself. When they grew, the brothers returned to claim their destiny. Together they dreamed of a city, a place that would rise higher than any other. But dreams often turn to rivalry, and bloodlines often end in betrayal. The vision of Rome could not be shared, and so Romulus, in a moment that shaped all of Roman history, struck his brother down. Remus fell, and Romulus became the first king of Rome. Rome was born not in peace, not in unity, but in fratricide. From its very first heartbeat, Rome carried within it the shadow of violence. A city that began with murder would forever live with it. From this myth grew a belief that Rome was chosen by destiny, watched by gods, and forged through sacrifice. And though the tale of Romulus and Remus may be legend, the Romans themselves believed it with all their hearts. For them, the blood of a brother was not a curse, but a foundation, a warning and a promise that greatness demands a price. Rome did not remain the kingdom of one man for long. The story says that its last king was overthrown, cast out in shame, and in his place rose something new, something bold, the Republic. A world without kings, a city ruled not by the will of one, but by the voice of many. Or at least, that was the dream. The Romans built their republic on order. There was the Senate, a gathering of the most powerful families, men who claimed to speak for the people, but served more often themselves. There were the assemblies, where citizens shouted their votes, where rich and poor alike could pretend that their voices mattered. And above them all stood the law, carved into tablets of bronze, spoken in the forum for every man to hear. Rome believed itself to be free, protected from tyranny, defended by balance and tradition. But beneath the surface, ambition stirred. Families plotted in silence, each one desperate for glory, for triumph, for the right to parade through the streets crowned in laurel and cheered by the masses. The Republic became a game, not of fairness, but of endless rivalry. Still, it worked. For centuries the system held. Generals led legions to war, returned with slaves, gold, and tribute, and the city swelled with wealth. The common people demanded bread and land, and sometimes they got it, Other times, they were crushed beneath the sandals of their betters, and in the shadows of the Senate House, daggers whispered promises that laws could never keep. Rome's republic was an engine, strong, relentless, devouring all in its path, but every engine overheats, and every system, no matter how carefully built, has its cracks. For the more Rome grew, the more fragile its republic became. The Romans liked to say that no man was above the law, but as the centuries passed, they discovered a darker truth. Sometimes one man could bend the law, twist it, break it, and still rise higher than anyone before. The Republic created not only citizens, but giants, men too powerful to be contained, and in their hands, the dream of freedom would turn into a nightmare of betrayal. The Republic was hungry. A city born of blood, raised on ambition, could not be content with hills and fields by the Tiber. It had to expand, to conquer, to prove itself against every neighbor, every rival, every kingdom that dared to challenge its destiny. And so, Rome went to war. At first, it fought for survival, skirmishes with neighboring tribes, bitter clashes with the Etruscans, battles to defend the city itself. But victory breeds appetite, and each triumph gave Rome a taste of something greater. Soon, the legions marched beyond Italy. There were wars with Samnites, wars with Greeks, wars that reshaped the land. Yet it was across the sea that Rome would meet its greatest rival, Carthage, a city of wealth, of ships, of trade, a city that controlled the waves, while Rome was still learning to build a fleet. The struggle between Rome and Carthage would be called the Punic Wars, and they would last for over a century. Out of these wars came stories whispered like nightmares. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who led his army and his elephants across the Alps, descending into Italy like a storm from the mountains. Roman legions shattered before him, cities fell, and for a time it seemed as though Rome itself might burn. But Rome never surrendered. They endured defeat after defeat, their armies destroyed, their fields ravaged, and yet they rose again. At last, Rome struck back. Scipio, the Roman commander, carried the war to Africa, and at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal was finally broken. Carthage was crushed, its power shattered, its glory reduced to ashes. In the end, the Romans would not merely defeat their enemy, they would erase it. The Senate ordered the city destroyed, its fields salted, its name cursed. Carthage was gone, and Rome stood supreme. By now, Rome was no longer just a city, it was an empire in all but name. Spain, Greece, North Africa, all fell under Roman rule. Legions marched endlessly, banners fluttered across new lands, and everywhere the eagle standard was carried, people whispered the same truth. Rome could not be stopped. But glory is a dangerous gift, for with every conquest came wealth beyond imagination. Gold flowed into the city, slaves filled its streets, and generals returned home, not as servants of the Republic, but as masters of their own destiny. Rome had grown powerful, yes, but in that power, the seeds of its undoing had already begun to take root. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so, it had created men too powerful to be controlled. Generals who commanded not just armies, but loyalty, fear, and dreams of glory. And among them, one name rose higher than all others: Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was ambitious beyond measure, brilliant in speech, ruthless in politics, unstoppable in war. He charmed the people with promises, outmaneuvered his rivals in the Senate, and when words were not enough, he let the sword speak for him. His campaigns in Gaul made him rich, beloved and feared. His legions carved through tribes and kingdoms, sending back treasures, slaves, and tales of a man who seemed almost divine. But ambition has a price. The The Senate began to fear him. Rivals like Pompey and Crassus, once allies, turned into enemies. Rome itself split. On one side, those who clung to the Republic. On the other, those who saw in Caesar a new kind of ruler. And then came the moment that would echo for all time. Caesar at the banks of the Rubicon, staring at the river that divided his province from Italy. To cross it with his army was treason, a declaration of civil war. The story says he paused only briefly before whispering words that still haunt history. Alea iacta est, the die is cast. His legions marched, and Rome trembled. Civil war engulfed the Republic. Cities burned, brothers fought brothers, and the Senate's power crumbled. Pompey fled, armies clashed across the Mediterranean, and one by one, Caesar crushed every rival who stood before him. When he returned to Rome, it was not as a servant of the Republic, but as its master, dictator for life, crowned with laurel, hailed as a god in all but name. The people cheered, the Senate bowed, but in the shadows, daggers were being sharpened. On the Ides of March 44 BC, Caesar entered the Senate house, believing himself untouchable. But there, among men he called friends, the knives struck. Brutus, Cassius, and others plunged their blades into his body. He fell at the foot of Pompey's statue, bleeding out beneath the marble gaze of his old rival. With his last breath, the Republic gasped with him. The dream of freedom was dead. The Senate had killed the man, but in doing so, they destroyed the world they had sworn to protect. For in Caesar's death, the Republic did not revive. It shattered, and from its ruins, something new, something darker and greater would be born, the Roman Empire. The death of Caesar left Rome bleeding. Senators who struck him down hoped to save the Republic, but instead they unleashed chaos. Civil wars flared again. Ambition, greed, and vengeance consumed the city. Out of the shadows of this storm, a new figure emerged, not a general of fire and fury, but a careful, patient, and calculating man. His name was Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Octavian was young, sickly even, and at first few took him seriously, but behind his frail appearance lay a mind sharper than steel. Where others fought with swords, he fought with patience, with alliances, with the slow grinding weight of politics. He gathered supporters, forged bonds with generals, and above all, wrapped himself in Caesar's legacy. He was not just Octavian anymore. He was Caesar's son, chosen to continue his destiny. Rome burned through another civil war. Octavian first allied with Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general, and Lepidus, a commander with armies of his own. Together they formed the Second Triumvirate, a three-headed monster ruling Rome with iron fists. Enemies were hunted, prescribed, executed. Heads of senators and nobles rolled in the forum. Even Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, fell to the knives of Octavian's men. But power shared is power contested. Soon mistrust grew. Lepidus was cast aside, and Octavian turned his eyes toward Antony. Antony had fallen under the spell of Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt, a woman of brilliance, beauty, and cunning. Together they dreamed of a new empire rising from Alexandria, one that would rival Rome itself. To Octavian, this was treason, a betrayal not only of him but of Rome, and so the war began. At Actium in 31 BC, fleets clashed on the waters, and history tipped toward destiny. Octavian's forces, disciplined and relentless, crushed Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled back to Egypt, where their story ended in tragedy, Antony falling on his sword, Cleopatra clasping the asp to her breast. Octavian returned to Rome, not as a rival among rivals, but as the sole master of the world. Yet he did not call himself king. Rome hated kings. Instead, he styled himself princeps, the first citizen. He rebuilt temples, reformed laws, and showered Rome with stability and wealth. Behind the careful mask of humility, however, he held absolute power, and so the Republic, in all but name, was dead. From its ashes rose something far grander, the Roman Empire, and Octavian, now Augustus, stood as its first emperor, a man who had taken chaos and forged order, who had turned ambition into eternity. With Augustus, the world entered a new age, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Roads stretched across continents, aqueducts carried water to cities, legions stood guard at the edges of civilization. But peace, like all things in Rome, was bought with blood. And though Augustus gave Rome stability, he also laid the foundations for centuries of emperors, some wise, some cruel, but all ruling in the shadow of his crown. When Augustus tightened his grip on power, Rome exhaled. For the first time in centuries, civil wars ended. No more generals marching against Rome. No more blood in the forum. Instead, peace, or at least peace for Rome and its citizens. For the provinces, it meant order under the shadow of the legions. Historians call this time the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It stretched across 200 years, from the reign of Augustus through the golden emperors that followed. Imagine it, from the misty highlands of Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the vineyards of Gaul to the deserts of Mesopotamia. One empire, one law, one coin, one Rome. This peace was not gentle. It was enforced by the steel of legions, by walls and watchtowers, by governors and tax collectors. But it allowed something rare in history, stability. Roads stretched like veins across the empire, carrying not only soldiers, but merchants, ideas, and stories. The saying was true: all roads led to Rome. The cities of the empire flourished. In Gaul, amphitheaters echoed with gladiators' roars. In the east, Greek philosophers debated in marble courtyards under Roman banners. In Africa, grain shipments fed millions in the capital. Everywhere the mark of Rome was carved into stone, aqueducts spanning valleys, temples rising to the gods, forums filled with traders and officials. The emperors who followed Augustus carried his torch, some wisely, others not. Tiberius, stern and suspicious; Caligula, cruel and unhinged; Claudius, the unexpected scholar who conquered Britain; and Nero, who played the lyre while Rome burned. Yet through madness and murder, the machine of empire kept turning. For the average Roman citizen, life was more secure than ever. The poor received bread from the state. The people were entertained by games in the Colosseum. Legions defended the borders. Roads made travel swift, and trade filled markets with goods from every corner of the known world. To a traveler, it must have felt eternal. You could leave Spain, march across Gaul, cross the Alps, dine in Rome, sail to Alexandria, and still be in the empire, still under the eagle's wings. But beneath this golden peace, shadows stirred. The provinces groaned under heavy taxes. Conquered peoples remembered their freedom, and emperors, each more powerful than any king, sometimes forgot the careful balance Augustus had built. The Pax Romana was real, magnificent, and lasting, but it was also fragile, like a marble statue, beautiful but brittle, waiting for cracks to form. At its height, Rome looked unshakable, but history whispers another truth: nothing lasts forever, not even empires. If Augustus built the empire, then those who followed proved just how fragile it could be. The title of emperor was the most powerful in the world, but it was also the most dangerous. To wear the purple was to live with daggers at your back, whispers in your halls, and poison in your wine. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, began as a competent general, but as emperor, he grew paranoid, retreating from Rome to the cliffs of Capri, where tales of cruelty and debauchery echoed through the city. He trusted no one, and those who served him often ended up dead. Rome learned its first lesson: emperors could rule with fear as well as with law. Then came Caligula. His reign began with promise, the young charismatic prince adored by the people. But power twisted him. Soon Caligula demanded worship as a living god, staged cruel games, and indulged in grotesque whims. He built golden statues of himself, mocked senators, and as legend tells it, even planned to make his horse a consul. The Senate conspired, daggers struck, and Caligula fell, leaving Rome in shock. Next was Claudius, an unlikely emperor, mocked as a stuttering, limping fool. Yet under his rule, Rome expanded into Britain, and the empire strengthened. Claudius showed that even those underestimated could change history. But betrayal waited close to home. His own wife poisoned him, clearing the path for her son Nero. And Nero, his name became a symbol of excess, cruelty, and madness. He fancied himself an artist, a poet, even a performer, dragging senators to applaud his recitals. When a great fire consumed Rome, whispers said Nero lit it himself, playing music while the city burned. He blamed Christians, unleashing brutal persecutions. In the end, hunted and abandoned, Nero chose suicide, declaring, "What an artist dies in me." Yet not all emperors were monsters. Some brought stability, wisdom, and even greatness. The Flavians restored order after Nero's chaos, and under Vespasian, the Colosseum rose. Trajan led Rome to its greatest territorial height, stretching the empire from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. Hadrian built walls to protect it, and Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, wrote meditations that still inspire today. Rome's emperors were a mirror of humanity itself, brilliant and monstrous, wise and foolish, builders and destroyers. Each carried the fate of millions in his hands, and each showed that the empire was only as strong as the man who ruled it. For the people of Rome, emperors were gods and demons, saviors and tyrants. Their statues towered in marble squares, their faces on coins, their words law. But behind the glory of the empire lay blood, betrayal, and the knowledge that even emperors could fall overnight. Madness, murder, glory, these were the rhythms of Rome's throne. What was it like to live in the heart of the Roman Empire? Not as an emperor, not as a senator, but as one of the millions of ordinary people whose lives turned beneath the shadow of the eagle. Rome was a city of contrasts. Marble temples gleamed in the sun, while narrow streets stank of sweat, smoke, and sewage. The rich lived in sprawling villas with gardens and fountains, while the poor crowded into insulae, tall wooden apartment blocks that creaked, groaned, and sometimes collapsed in flames. For the common people, survival depended on two things: bread and circuses. Grain shipments from Egypt and Africa kept bellies full, while grand spectacles kept minds distracted. Emperors knew this well. A hungry crowd could riot, but a fed and entertained crowd could be loyal. And oh, the spectacles! Imagine the roar of 50,000 voices in the Colosseum as gladiators stepped into the arena, swords gleaming in the sun, blood spilled on the sand, and the people cheered, not just for victory but for survival. Gladiators were slaves, prisoners, or volunteers chasing fame, and their duels became the empire's greatest theater. Chariot races thundered through the Circus Maximus, teams of horses tearing down the track as fans screamed themselves hoarse. The blues and the greens, the great racing factions, commanded loyalty like modern sports teams, their rivalries spilling into riots that sometimes set the city aflame. But life was not only games. Markets bustled with spices from the east, wine from Gaul, silk from China, and strange beasts brought for the arenas. Roman baths offered relief, warm waters, gossip, business deals, even libraries under vaulted ceilings. For a few coins, a man could wash away the dust of the streets and step into a world of marble and steam. Religion, too, shaped daily life. Romans prayed to a pantheon of gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, but as the empire grew, so did its faiths. Egyptian Isis, Persian Mithras, and the strange new sect called Christianity spread quietly through back alleys and private homes, promising salvation to the poor and downtrodden. Still, life was fragile. Disease swept through crowded cities, fires consumed entire neighborhoods, and famine always lurked. Yet for all its dangers, Rome was a city unlike any other, a place where you could feel the pulse of the world in its streets, where peasants and princes walked the same forum, where the empire's heartbeat never ceased. For the Romans, bread and circuses were not mere distractions, they were life itself. The games gave meaning, the bread gave survival, and together they bound the people to their empire. The emperors knew, as long as the people had food and entertainment, Rome would endure. For a while it worked, but nothing, not bread, not games, not even marble and power could hold back time forever. For centuries, Rome seemed eternal. The empire stretched from ocean to desert, from mountains to endless plains. Its legions guarded the frontiers, its emperors carved their names into marble, and its citizens believed the world would forever belong to Rome. But history has a cruel way of proving even the mightiest wrong. The first cracks appeared quietly. The empire had grown too vast, too heavy to carry. Armies had to be stationed at every border, in Britain, in Gaul, in Germany, along the Danube and the Euphrates. Soldiers were expensive, and the treasury bled. Taxes climbed higher, crushing farmers and merchants alike. Grain grew scarce, inflation rose, and coins were cut with cheap metals. Worse still, emperors came and went like shadows. Assassinations, coups, and civil wars plagued the throne. In 1 century alone, Rome saw dozens of emperors, some reigning mere weeks before being struck down by rivals. The empire no longer had stability. It had a carousel of ambition and blood. On the frontiers, enemies watched. Germanic tribes pressed at the Rhine. Persians tested the eastern defenses, and in the deserts, rebellions brewed. Once the legions would have crushed them with ease. Now, stretched thin and led by uncertain rulers, Rome struggled to respond. Even nature seemed to turn against the empire. Plagues swept through the cities, killing millions. Crops failed, trade routes faltered, and famine stalked the provinces. Hungry people rioted, armies mutinied, and generals seized power for themselves. And yet Rome endured. Brilliant emperors rose even in the darkness. Aurelian, who reunited the fractured empire, and Diocletian, who reformed it, splitting it into east and west to make it governable. These were bandages, temporary fixes to hold back the inevitable. For beneath every reform lay the same truth. Rome was no longer the Rome of Augustus, or even Trajan. The Senate had become a shadow. Emperors were soldiers more than statesmen, and loyalty to the empire gave way to loyalty to warlords, factions, and survival. The marble still shone in the sun, the Colosseum still roared, but beneath the glitter lay decay. Rome was not falling yet, but it was bleeding, and the wounds were deep. The people still believed in the eternal city, but history was whispering its warning. Eternity does not belong to empires. For centuries, Rome had stood as the master of the world. Its roads stretched across continents. Its armies ruled from the misty isles of Britain to the sands of Arabia. Its emperors basked in marble palaces, while the Colosseum thundered with applause. To imagine a world without Rome was unthinkable, and yet the unthinkable happened. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the cracks in the empire had become gaping wounds. The once mighty legions were weakened. often filled with mercenaries, men who fought for coin, not loyalty. Emperors were crowned and killed in dizzying succession, sometimes ruling for months, sometimes mere days. The treasury was empty, the people weary, and enemies pressed on every border. From the north came the Goths, fierce and hungry for land. They crossed rivers and mountains, no longer afraid of the Roman name. In 378 AD, at Adrianople, a Roman emperor led his army against them and was utterly destroyed. The legions, once invincible, lay broken on the field. For the first time, barbarians had shattered Rome itself. Then came the Vandals, sweeping across Gaul and Spain, crossing into Africa, and seizing the breadbasket of the empire. From the east, the Huns, led by Attila, thundered across Europe like a storm, their horsemen spreading terror wherever they rode. Rome could bribe them, delay them, but never truly stop them, and in 410 AD, the unthinkable, Alaric and his Visigoths marched into Rome itself. For 3 days, the Eternal City was sacked, its treasures plundered, its people enslaved, its marble temples desecrated. The world gasped. If Rome itself could fall, was anything safe? Yet the empire limped on. The western half, weaker and poorer than the east, struggled desperately to survive. Emperors became puppets, controlled by generals or foreign kings. By 476 AD, the last Roman emperor in the west, Romulus Augustus, a boy barely a teenager, was deposed by a Germanic warlord named Odoacer. No grand battle, no fiery apocalypse, just a quiet end. The Roman Empire in the west was gone, its cities crumbled, its roads fell to ruin, its statues shattered. The Eternal City was eternal no more, and yet not all was lost. In the east, in Constantinople, the empire endured as Byzantium, carrying Rome's legacy for another 1,000 years. Its laws, its language, its culture, all of it lived on, woven into the fabric of Europe and beyond. The fall of Rome was not a single moment, but a slow unraveling, a great flame that burned too brightly, too long, until at last it flickered out. But though the empire died, its shadow never left us. We still walk its roads, speak its words, build in its styles, and dream in its stories. Rome is gone, but Rome is everywhere, and in that sense, perhaps the empire never truly fell. Rome has fallen, the eagle standard is lowered, the emperors are gone, the Colosseum is silent. But in truth, Rome never truly died. Its spirit lingers, etched into every stone of our world. Look around you. Modern law, architecture, language, even the idea of citizenship, all flow from Rome. The Romans built aqueducts that inspired modern plumbing, roads that became the blueprint for highways, and legal codes that still shape justice today. Their vision of governance, a senate, elections, checks and balances, echoes in parliaments and congresses across the world. The languages of Rome never disappeared. Latin gave birth to Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Even English, though Germanic in roots, is filled with Latin words, the whispers of an empire long gone but not forgotten. Every time we say justice, empire, military, forum, we speak with Rome's voice. The church too carried Rome's torch. As emperors fell, bishops rose. Rome became the seat of the papacy, the spiritual capital of Christianity. The Pope's power outlasted that of the Caesars, and the marble basilicas of Rome replaced the pagan temples of Jupiter and Mars. And in the East, Constantinople thrived as the Byzantine Empire, the living continuation of Rome, blending Roman law with Greek culture and Christian faith. Its domes and mosaics glittered for 1,000 years after the Western Empire crumbled. Even in dreams of power, Rome's shadow loomed. Charlemagne was crowned as a new emperor, The Holy Roman Empire rose, and later nations claimed to be heirs of Rome, from Moscow, calling itself the Third Rome, to modern leaders who invoke its legacy. The very idea of empire is bound to Rome, the city that defined it. But perhaps the greatest legacy is less tangible. Rome taught the world that civilizations can rise from nothing. A small village on the Tiber grew into the mistress of continents. And Rome also taught that no empire, no matter how vast, is invincible. Power fades, glory decays, and eternity belongs to no crown. And yet, here we are, centuries later, still telling their story, still walking their ruins, marveling at their aqueducts, and whispering their names. Augustus, Nero, Trajan, Caesar. Rome lives not in marble or armies, but in memory. So when you hear the word Rome, you are not hearing about a dead empire. You are hearing about a dream of greatness, of ambition, of triumph and tragedy, a dream that refuses to die. Rome has fallen, but Rome is eternal.